Hi, I'm Sean.
I'm Renee.
This is Hope in Crisis, a new podcast series about rights and democracy and how technology can enable or disable it.
Listen to Hope in Crisis on Apple Podcasts or wherever you like to listen to your podcast.
So today we're going to talk with Mary Hoy, I think.
Yes.
All right. It's always hard for me to pronounce names that are, like, it looks like it should be Chinese, but she's going to pronounce it Cantonese, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's always tricky. Okay.
Names are always hard.
They are. So she's a reporter at Quartz and does some freelancing for Washington Post. Post is that's Bezos's newspaper. Trump calls fake news.
So biased.
You got it. And she does trail running, which we'll see. Maybe we get to ask her about that. And it seems to me, at least, that she's really interested in geopolitics, tech, big data, and of the intersection of the stuff that we care about.
And civil rights.
And civil rights, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She wrote about graffitis being removed on Google Map. So in Hong Kong, people made graffitis about democracy and freedom. And then these photos were all blurred or removed on Google Maps. So she wrote one piece about it. And then there's also a movement in Thailand going on right now. And she wrote about how people are not trusting Twitter. So they're using crypto social instead.
Yeah, there's some website. It's been around for a long time. It's called Minds. And it seemed like the first day that there was that Twitter thing in Thailand, like 100,000 people switched to it and it crashed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's huge. So pressure leads to innovation.
Yes. Yes.
Right. So do you have any interesting questions for her?
Well, I think let's talk with her about this idea of Cultural Revolution 2.0. It seems very central to her. And then, of course, let's get some of her insights on the role of tech. I hope to get insights of both big tech as in American big tech, but also China big tech.
Yeah, I look forward to talking to her because what she's doing is very similar with what we're doing. She's using English, the language, as a medium to spread messages and then to help more people understand what's going on in Asia.
All right.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Hope in Crisis. We're really excited today to have our first remote session with Mary. Welcome to the show. So, Mary, would you like to introduce yourself to us and the audience? Talk about how you started your journalist life and why you started covering these features about Hong Kong's movement and technologies.
Yeah, so my name is Mary Hoy. I'm a reporter for Quartz. I'm from Hong Kong. I'm based in Hong Kong. And I've been with Quartz now for a year and a half, since April of last year. And from Hong Kong, we cover kind of broadly the Asian region at the intersection of geopolitics, tech, business, and how all of that fits into kind of this larger picture of how the global economy is changing and trying to make sense of that. And of course, since last June, when the protests kicked off in Hong Kong, kind of 90% of my time, or more than that, of much of last year, was really just focused on the Hong Kong protests and how questions of technology and protest movements, protest tactics, language and culture, how all of that plays out through the protests. And now that the protests are no longer kind of as much on the streets, the focus has shifted slightly to kind of the ramifications and the continuing changes in Hong Kong civil society, and then in addition to that, also keeping an eye on kind of other kind of broader economic questions to do with China and its role in the world.
Mary, can I get you to explain this protest and what's going on to, say, a Western audience that has not followed closely? I mean, even myself, like, I live in Taiwan. Most of my time is here, but I feel like I've struggled to keep up with the story. So can you kind of take us from day one of the protests, like what was going on, what what were sort of the conditions that led to these protests?
Yeah, so the protests that kicked off in June of 2019 is kind of the latest chapter of Hong Kong's pro-democracy, Hong Kong's democracy movement. And it was, kicked off by this controversial extradition law that would have meant that Hong Kongers could be sent to mainland China to face trial where they are not guaranteed a fair trial. That was the proximate cause of the protests, but of course over time it kind of morphed into kind of just general discontent and frustrations with how the government was handling the protests, with how the government was not listening to the popular will, and also the excessive use of force by the police in cracking down on the peaceful protesters, largely peaceful protesters. And so it just became this huge political problem that really saw no kind of resolution, in large part because the Hong Kong government's hands were tied. It really had no ultimate authority. Beijing was really the ones that was calling the shots, and it was kind of unclear how or whether they would ever budge. And so the protests carried on for months, large-scale, street-wide protests. And now we're in kind of the next chapter of that, which is Beijing's heavy-handed crackdown on Hong Kong civil society, changing laws, implementing new laws like the national security law that we saw come into force in late June, July 1st. And really kind of reshaping the entire Hong Kong society to fit into China's mold of total control, of kind of total national security, where anything that questions anything that pushes up against the Communist Party's hold on power is regarded as a threat to national security and must be put down. And so now we're in this chapter of seeing Hong Kong being kind of folded into China's authoritarian grip.
Yeah, so for me, I just cannot imagine how difficult it is to have this pro-democracy movement in an authoritarian regime. I think that the two values clash. So basically, a authoritarian government will not tolerate democracy, because democracy means that people have the right. They have the right to decide their future. They have the right to decide who they want to authorize to run the government, right? So can you tell us more about the pro-democracy movement and the progress, if there's any?
Yeah, I guess at the heart of all of this is this basic contradiction that's really kind of baked into the very existence of Hong Kong since its handover from being a British colony to Chinese sovereignty, where there was this attempt to set up Hong Kong as this partially free city with guaranteed civil liberties and rights, a Bill of Rights even as part of Hong Kong's constitution that was molded in large part based on the International Covenant on Human Rights. I forget exactly the title. And at the same time, still have your kind of ultimate master as China, where these civil liberties and rights aren't protected. So how do you have these two diametrically opposed systems coexisting? And for a while it did. Though it was always kind of on shaky ground, and over the years we've seen China try to rein in Hong Kong a bit more, and as you have more and more frustrations piling up, and then you have something like the extradition bill that really shook many Hong Kongers, and kind of brought to the fore their fears of everything that the authoritarian system represents in China. That really kicked off, I guess, blew the lid off of everything and sparked this mass protest movement.
And could you talk a little bit about what the tech companies, like what role are they playing? And I'm really most curious as to how you as a journalist see your role and the relationship to, say, government and tech. By tech, you can either talk about sort of technology itself or big tech, Facebook, Google's, these kind of Western, tech corporations. I would also be really curious if you could share any insights about the Chinese tech companies, and are they doing anything interesting in Hong Kong?
Or blocking anything?
I guess as we've seen over the past, year or two in protest movements, not just in Hong Kong, but more recently in Thailand, in Belarus, across the US, tech really has played a huge role in shaping the direction and the dynamics of popular mass protest movements. They're a way for protesters to communicate with each other, to get their message out, to innovate on the spot and figure out how to change their protest tactics, how to organize themselves, what kind of posters, what kind of hashtags to use. So all of that is very much enabled by the technology platforms. And in the case of Hong Kong, the foreign tech companies find themselves sometimes in a bit of a tough and tricky situation where they want to have access to the highly lucrative market in China, but at the same time, they should kind of stay true to kind of the liberal democratic values of the countries where they originate from. So, for example, the US. So to give you a specific example, we have Apple. So last year, one protester here in Hong Kong developed this app called HongKongMap.live, which is this kind of real-time dynamic crowdsourced map to show where protests were happening, where police had fired tear gas, deployed water cannons. And there was a way for protesters, but also just non-protesters, people who just want to go down the street and get something to eat, to figure out where the action is so that they can avoid tear gas. But Apple banned that app from its app store, saying that the app was enabling criminal activity, that it was enabling protesters to ambush police officers, and that hence it was not to be allowed on the App Store, and subsequently took it down. So there you see a very interesting contradiction, I guess, where the app, anyone's kind of common understanding of this app is that it isn't providing you any more information than, say, watching a live stream would. And so to say that it's enabling criminal activity is quite farcical. But the fact that Apple had to, I guess, bow down to the pressure imposed by Beijing authorities to take the app down really says a lot about the position that tech companies can find themselves in when they're trying to balance both their profit motive and, I guess, the values that they espouse.
Do you know details about that? Like, do you know if Beijing was pressuring Apple through Hong Kong law, or were they using sort of China's judicial system? Do you know about how that was working behind the scenes?
Yeah, and it was just depressing for me to know that a life-saving app can be banned and labeled as helping or contributing to criminal activities. And we talked about black boxes the other day in our different episode about how the entire app store is a huge black box. And then when your app is removed, there's almost no way for you to file a complaint. But I'm thinking about roundabouts. Is there any other way for people to upload this app for other people to use? Like with Android, you have APKs, so users can download an app without going to the Play Store.
Yeah, in this instance, the developer made it into a web app. So, obviously there's the Android app that's uploaded onto the Google Play. So the roundabout way here was to make it into a web app. And this problem repeated itself later on in the year in June, July. When the opposition camp in Hong Kong held its primary elections ahead of the official elections, which would have been in September, that are now delayed. And so they held this unofficial primary to try and field the strongest slate of candidates. And they used this one app that was kind of distributed, designed to be resilient against any kind of cyber attack, to protect privacy so that voters' information wouldn't easily fall into the hands of authorities. So that app was uploaded and authorized by the Google Play Store, but it never got approved, and to my knowledge still has not yet been approved by the Apple App Store. And after the unofficial primary election, the Hong Kong and Beijing government came out and made it very clear that this unofficial primary election was illegal. Not exactly sure why, but they say that it's an illegal exercise. And so one can conjecture and theorize as to kind of what kind of pressure was put on Apple behind the scenes. I poked around a little bit more afterwards and saw another app developed by, I think, two Europeans, I forget where exactly they're from, that kind of served very much the same purpose. They market themselves as a way to kind of hold unofficial polls, especially in places where maybe democratic elections aren't being held. And that app is readily available on the App Store, on the Apple App Store. So the question as to why this particular one in Hong Kong was not approved, I think leads to many different questions about what kind of politics played into the decision making.
I hijacked your question, right?
Go ahead.
No. You were asking about the judicial laws?
No, I mean, I was just curious, like, was there any transparency into Apple's decision to do this? Like, did they say we were complying with law, or did they just be silent and take it down?
I'll have to look back. So much has happened since then, I don't remember the exact details. But I think they did quote something about them having to follow the laws of the local jurisdictions in which they operate, but I forget exactly what the details are and which jurisdiction they were referring to.
Can you explain a little bit about this security law? So my understanding is that Hong Kong had some basic law and there was not a security law. And during the protests, Beijing basically said, hey, go do a security law or else we'll do it for you. And then they created this really big thing, and I guess you have some real concerns about Article 33. Can you talk a little bit about this? Like, first, what is this security law, and what was it trying to solve? Like, what was the issue that Hong Kong wasn't able to have a security law, if I'm saying this correctly?
Yeah. So in Hong Kong's basic law, which is kind of Hong Kong's mini constitution, one of the articles says that Hong Kong should enact its own national security legislation. That has not been done over the years, in large part because of widespread opposition to it back in 2003, when 500,000 people came out to march against the implementation of a national security law. So, fast forward to 2020, nearly 17 years later, China has definitely run out of patience with Hong Kong, especially in light of the months of protests that were, honestly a huge embarrassment for Beijing, that these protesters were able to make international headlines all over the world. And so they finally decided that, I guess now is the time to really crack down, and that they had enough of protests in Hong Kong. So they implement what is called the national security law, where I guess national security is defined very, very broadly by Beijing as anything that has to do with upholding and safeguarding the one-party system. And so at the core of this national security law is that very broad, vague and sweeping definition of what national security is. And so now that is in place, it kind of technically it criminalizes four different crimes: subversion, secession, foreign interference. What's the fourth? Wow, I'm suddenly blanking. But, a large set of vaguely defined activities that are kind of so vaguely, that are so vaguely defined that really anything that Beijing doesn't like can be deemed to be in breach of the national security law, and hence land you in prison for potentially quite a large amount of time. It also enables China to directly set up a national security unit in Hong Kong that's above and beyond existing law. They aren't governed by local laws. They can essentially, it sets up a secret police organization in Hong Kong, and they're allowed to do whatever they please. And so I guess kind of both those things taken together, both the vague and broad definition of what the crimes are, that the heavy punishment, and also the sweeping powers that it now gives to police and the national security unit and the government, means that state control over people's everyday lives has dramatically increased, and people do, I guess, live in fear of whether anything they say or do could land them in jail. And of course, Beijing frames all of this as good for Hong Kong, as restoring stability. But if we, I guess, look back at history, different political theorists have noted, particularly Hannah Arendt has noted, that a lot of totalitarians dangle this idea of stability as a way to control populace. And I think that's what exactly we're seeing right now.
I think what Hong Kong is doing right now is very amazing. I think that what's going on is a tragedy, but I think that Hong Kong is demonstrating to all of us, the entire world, that democracy is very valuable. Because I think that right now in the very polarized social media, some people would criticize democracy and say that, oh, democracy is very inefficient, or democracy is a messy, chaotic process. And that implies when you have a very centralized and a very authoritarian government, everything works better in a more efficient way. And then the government is more commanding. But the reason why I want to raise awareness about authoritarian government is because it violates some very basic human rights, like the freedom of speech, or the freedom of traveling, or the freedom of getting education, or the freedom of making some positive changes to the future. So I think that Hong Kong is waking up everyone in other parts of the world that communism is not something that communism is not something that can be accepted for the sake of capitalism.
Mary, you mentioned in one of your articles you view this as almost like a cultural revolution 2.0. Can you explain what you mean by that? And then I'm also very curious as to what is different from 1.0 to 2.0. Is like 2.0 more social? Is this like Web 2.0? Like what is it that makes it 2.0?
Or more influential.
Yeah. What's going on there?
Sure. Well, 2.0 just, I guess, more reference to the fact that it has echoes of the Cultural Revolution that we saw in the 60s. But of course, obviously, we're now not in the 60s, but it's happening again. So I guess it refers more to kind of echoes of what we've previously seen happening again. And I guess more concretely, it's referring to this culture of friends or family snitching on each other and reporting each other for being in violation of the national security law, not being patriotic enough, questioning the Communist Party's legitimacy and credibility. And even as recently as last week or the week before, the police rolled out a hotline on WeChat and also just a regular phone number for people to report instances that they see in daily life where people have violated the national security law. And that kind of gets to the very heart of this Cultural Revolution 2.0, where there is now an official channel and by implication official encouragement to report on people who you might know, who you see violating the national security law. And in my story that I did earlier this year, I talked to doctors, civil servants, and teachers about their fears of, just what they get up to in their daily work lives that they now fear could land them in hot water if they accidentally say, quote unquote, the wrong thing or wear the wrong thing or somehow signal kind of incorrect political leanings.
So tell us more, tell all of our audience members more about the importance of cultural revolutions, the two revolutions, 1.0 and 2.0. Why do people in other parts of the world need to know about this and about the consequences? So in my personal experience, when I had to talk about cultural revolution, the first one in English, it's usually because people ask me about the languages used in Taiwan and China. People would say, oh, so are you using the same language? And then I have to explain that, oh, we're using the traditional Chinese characters and they're using the simplified Chinese characters. And then the conversation would lead to cultural revolution. And then for foreigners, okay, people who receive information in English only, their response is, oh, pity. Sorry that their cultures and temples and old buildings were burned. And that's it. That's it. So their response was like, bummer, but it has nothing to do with me, right? So I think
we have a history of destroying old things. I mean, this is just Western culture.
Yeah, but I think some values were destroyed too in the Cultural Revolution. Something unethical was done and passed down in the first Cultural Revolution. That's my personal opinion. So tell us more about the Cultural Revolutions and why people need to care about it.
Yeah, I think in both instances, both 1.0 and 2.0, it's maybe, you talk about values. And yeah, I do agree. It is the kind of the insidious nature of what we might call the Cultural Revolution is how it really tears apart kind of the fabric of society by destroying trust between people, it kind of in pursuit of this goal that's been implemented from above to uphold certain political goals and to root out certain elements that are deemed to kind of deviate from that political goal. So I think, beyond just Hong Kong or China, we have seen this elsewhere in the world throughout history. And, for people who might not be as familiar with Chinese history and who might get a little tripped up on the Cultural Revolution label, I think maybe we could point them towards, say, instances in other authoritarian regimes where people are encouraged to rat out each other because they want to showcase kind of their total loyalty to the political regime over their personal relationships. So I think kind of that's what I'm trying to get at more than maybe the exact whether the Cultural Revolution 1.0 and 2.0 are exact kind of carbon copies of each other.
Mary, do you have any personal takes on what are some possible paths forward? And is there any that you feel are hopeful?
For Hong Kong?
Yeah, I mean, sorry to ask such a dark question, but I'd like to try to understand a bit more about how you see the future. Like, what are some possibilities?
Well, I think it's hard to place kind of any kind of confidence or trust in established kind of institutions right now. We just had today, I guess we're talking on, what is it now, the 11th of November, just today, Beijing kind of passed down this resolution that enables it effectively to expel any politician from Hong Kong's legislature that they don't like, and effectively allows them to take entire control over the legislature and expel all opposition. And Carrie Lam, the chief executive, even came out to say, well, we don't have to be ashamed of the fact that there will no longer be an opposition because we can pass bills more quickly. So she is openly proud of having a rubber stamp parliament. So I think the way forward is maybe not to place any kind of trust or hope in these kinds of constitutions that are not constitutions, these institutions that maybe people previously had looked to as a way of pushing back against the state. And really, right now, it's really up to, I think, civil society, where through schools or local businesses or families and friend groups, small acts of daily resistance, I guess, for lack of a better word, can keep people together in kind of their, I guess, their fight for freedom and liberal democratic values. And a large part of it is also to not get lost in these kind of day-to-day developments where it feels like sometimes you have a constant kind of unending stream of bad news and kind of crackdowns, and so kind of keeping track of those and also calling things out for what they are, really paying a lot of attention to government rhetoric and not getting not becoming desensitized to kind of the whitewashing and the glossing over of certain facts that the government might like to put out through their propaganda or their statements.
What do you think your job looks like 1 year from now?
1 year from now? Well, obviously, press freedom in Hong Kong has come under immense pressure and is facing a lot of kind of dire threats. We have reporters getting arrested, newsrooms being raided, newspaper owners also being arrested. None of that is good. I guess, there is this kind of general kind of miasma over that hangs over the press corps in Hong Kong. But at the same time, we kind of just have to keep doing what we're doing. I guess right now, I would say I don't feel an acute sense of risk personally, but of course it's always there, and I think what we have to do is just kind of continue reporting and describing things as they are.
Do you think there's anything that the tech community can do to shed some light on the hope and facilitate your vision for yourself for the next year? You talked about civil society, and a lot of our listeners are organizing hackathons, and there are hackathons for democratic development, there are hackathons for education or human rights. So,
and the GovZero stuff, is there something like GovZero going on in Hong Kong?
There is. I'm not too familiar with that community, but I do know that they are active here. It seems like, just even collating information that the government is not happy to share, or in a kind of a coherent way, and taking it upon ourselves as civil society to do some of those things, to collect, say, a database of the number of times that police have fired tear gas, or the number of times that they've broken their own kind of rules for how they should engage with protesters. Things like that, where you are collating information and then using that to make sense of what you're seeing and what's happening. I think that in itself is quite powerful, and I would say that would be something that the tech community can really help with.
And what about tools? Are you seeing people, for example, adopt Bitcoin? Any sort of censorship resistant technology? I know you wrote an article about mines happening in Thailand. Do you see the people in Hong Kong forming online communities that are helping to get more strength in numbers? Are people using Tor there more? Are there any technologies that you are excited by these days?
I guess, VPN downloads have gone through the roof. People are paying much more attention to encrypting their communications and just generally kind of their digital security. So I think anything that kind of falls under that umbrella, I'm sure people would readily embrace.
What do you think the Western world should learn from Hong Kong, or what can the Western world learn from Hong Kong, and what could we do to help Hong Kong?
I think what we've seen throughout the protests is how the Hong Kong protest movement this time around was able to drum up much more momentum than in years past because it focused or it devoted energy and resources to spreading its message out to an international audience, and also kind of working directly with foreign governments and politicians, and for example, lobbying US politicians to pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, or the Hong Kong Freedom and Choice Act that's currently being kind of going through the process, which would allow Hong Kongers kind of special refugee status in the US. I don't think any of that would have been possible without kind of the grassroots diplomacy that we saw over the past year, both in the US, also the UK, as we see with the UK now granting a path to citizenship for not just kind of British national overseas holders, but also people who were eligible for that. So up to 3 million people who can eventually settle in the UK if they wish to. So things like that, I think, really show kind of the power of taking or acknowledging kind of all these linkages of between countries, and how kind of expanding your protest movement beyond your immediate physical borders can actually help put pressure on the government that you're ultimately protesting against.
Yeah, thank you very much for all of the information and the insight. I hope that the next time we talk, you're in a safer place.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks a lot, Mary. Really appreciate you spending time with us today.
Thank you for having me. This was good to chat.
So, how do you like it, the talk?
It was as I thought it was going to be. Pretty
As
depressing,
dark?
pretty heavy, very dark.
Yeah, I was trying to bring up hope in crisis, but it was so difficult.
Only crisis.
Yeah, and tragedies. So, yeah, let's talk about something different. Do you see hope
Well,
in this?
I do actually.
Oh, okay.
And, there's that saying, necessity is the mother of all invention.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what we're seeing is a collision of different worldviews or legal systems or political parties. And increasingly people will realize that we just got to come up with better ways of organizing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel that just like COVID is driving so much online,
Yeah.
that things like these Hong Kong protests are going to drive what we would call governance down closer to the people.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll realize that the politicians aren't going to solve your problems, that we need new tools, we need new ways of organizing to solve our own problems. And so I think that is the silver lining out of all of this. Just like how COVID sucks and it's making a mess out of the US,
Mm-hmm.
I think that this protest sucks and it's making a mess out of Hong Kong. But the people will hopefully, this is the hopeful side, is the people will use this to create the tools that we all need.
How about people in other places in the rest of the
Well, I
world?
wanted to ask you this one, right? So we've got this, what do you call it? One system, two countries.
One country, two systems.
Oh, yeah.
It means that Hong Kong is part of China, so
Yeah.
one country, but two different systems.
But they say the same thing for Taiwan, right?
They want to propose that to Taiwan.
Okay, but I mean, the U.S. acknowledges, at least from my perspective, that it's a one one country, two systems. So
I'm not sure if the United States acknowledges that Taiwan is a part. That's tricky.
it's really tricky.
Yeah. Okay.
Like, how do you feel? Like personally, when you
About
listen,
Hong Kong?
no, like when you listen to her speak about Hong Kong, like as a Taiwanese person, how does that make you feel?
Okay, first of all, I'm really sorry about what's going on in Hong Kong. And I think it would be too it would be too offensive to say that, oh, I can relate to that, or I can partly understand what's going on. But I think that their experiences are a great mirror or a window for people in Taiwan. First of all, it burst a bubble. So in the last 40 years, I've heard so many Taiwanese politicians talking about that one day if Taiwan becomes a financial hub in Asia Pacific, then Taiwan is invincible. Like China would never attack Taiwan because so many international companies are investing in Taiwan. So if Taiwan is in any kind of war, then these international companies will want to protect their assets, and then they would use different kinds of forces like lobbying or money to stop China from attacking Taiwan. But look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a financial hub in Asia. Yeah. So
It seems like they're all moving now. They're moving to Shanghai, Singapore.
Yeah. But this saying is based on the Switzerland model. So Switzerland is very small and vulnerable and doesn't have a huge military, but it's secured itself by building its financial powers. So I think people in Hong Kong and Taiwan believe that if we become a financial hub, or if we attract a lot of money, and then other countries and other governments and other businesses have a lot of assets here, then we're invincible. Obviously, that's a fantasy.
That feels so. So what you learn from Hong Kong is that idea is probably not true.
Yeah, it's not realistic.
I see.
And the other thing is that I feel very privileged to be born and grow up here and live here. I still believe that human rights are given. It's just that they can be taken away by different governments. And right now, human rights in Hong Kong is taken away by a communist party.
Well, and corporations too. I mean, Apple seems to be perfectly willing to help out.
I know. I was like...
It's like, damn it, Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
Why can't you be alive now?
I was trying so hard to come up with some light or something hopeful in our conversation. I was trying to say, oh, is there anything technologists can do? No. Right now, the tech companies are worsening the situation. They're not helping.
You should separate technologists from technology companies in your mind, because they can be separate. Like, some of the best technologists are outside these companies.
True.
And these companies are, because they've become such monopolies, we've talked about this before, they're not innovating like they used to.
Right.
Instead, they're trying to protect their incumbency.
Right. So let me rephrase.
Yeah.
I think technologists can help, but at the same time, they need to scale up their contribution.
Well, it's hard because, like she said, that Apple blocks the entrance to the phone.
Right.
Google doesn't probably block
I should
the phone.
just blame the big tech companies.
Oh, it's very hard. Like, we need ways to route around them. It's almost like the way the internet worked with TCP/IP. If there was some malignant actor that's dropping data, dropping packets, then TCP/IP will just route around it. It's like the people need to find some way of routing around these big tech companies.
Yeah, so we're basically facing two kinds of authoritarian regimes. One is communism and one is tech monopoly or capitalist monopoly.
Yeah.
So that's how I feel. I'm sorry for our audience that we didn't come up with hope in crisis. But I think if we make sure that people understand the scope of the crisis, then there can be hope.
So I keep thinking that Hong Kong should do this GovZero stuff. like I heard a podcast a couple of weeks ago with Audrey Tang and Tristan Harris.
Oh.
And it was such a great podcast. And I felt like I knew what GovZero was. And then the way she described GovZero is it's a fork of a government service. And I was like, what? Is that what it is? It's like there's some government service that's being provided and you don't think it's good enough. And so what you do is you go fork it and you make your own.
Yeah.
And then you offer it to the people.
Right.
I mean, if that's not the solution to Hong Kong, I don't know what is.
That's what Taiwan did with public health.
It's incredible. I think that's that right there is the hope, is if we can somehow get the GovZero people to go over there, help them out.
I
think Hong Kong has too many bankers.
Yeah, and then I think that your proposal is a little bit too wishful. So for that to work, for GovZero to become a fork of government service, there needs to be trust between government and people.
Well, eventually. I mean, people just fork it first.
Oh.
Right? Like, if you look at the history of the sunflower movement, I mean, I heard this from you, right? Like, the government didn't trust the people first. The people just did it. Right?
Yeah, but
Trust came later.
I think Hong Kong is just more complicated.
I think there's a possible path. Like, this is the only path that I'm seeing that feels hopeful is let's GovZero this thing.
Yeah. So I had one question in mind. I was thinking about that. I can ask her, looking forward, do you see a path? And then you took it.
I tried.
Yeah.
But she didn't give us a good answer, did she?
I think she couldn't give us a good answer.
Maybe she has a great answer, but because it's a strategy or a tactic, she doesn't want to reveal it.
Yeah, she has to keep it hidden.
Yeah, so let's hope for that.
Okay.
Yeah. All right.
So thank you very much for listening to this episode. If you have any hopeful ideas, let us know. This podcast is brought to you by Bitmark and Girls in Tech Taiwan.
So Bitmark was founded from the belief that data is the next major asset class. And so what Bitmark does is create tools for individuals to gain control and access over their data and eventually unlock all kinds of new value in that data.
Girls in Tech Taiwan is the Taiwan chapter of a global nonprofit focused on the engagement, education, and empowerment of influential women in technology and entrepreneurship.